Thank you all for coming. My name is Andy Waterhouse. I'm the director of the Robert Mondavi Institute, and this is the first of our series on Savor. To welcome you all this afternoon is Ken Burtis, faculty advisor to the Chancellor and Provost, and our sort of provost in waiting whenever there's a problem. So Ken.
Thank you, Andy. That's a new one. So good evening, everyone. I'm also a professor of genetics. It is my privilege to welcome you to From Farm to Table and Back Again, Innovations to Feed More with Less. This is the inaugural event in the new UC Davis series that Andy mentioned, Savor, Lectures on Food and Wine. And I'm very honored to introduce you to what promises to be an important and fascinating new forum. This evening's topic sells itself, invoking the viral ideas of farm to table, innovation, and more with less, as well as sustainability. We should all be grateful that a large and rapidly growing portion of a population of this country and others are keenly interested in these concepts, finding in them both urgent calls to action and pathways towards a better future. More specifically, this event this evening focuses on food waste, which at first hearing sounds like a less appealing topic than farm to table. It is easy to understand how the physical character of food waste, the practical obstacles in finding effective solutions, and cultural factors have helped keep this problem hidden in plain sight. This is clearly a highly complex problem requiring a multidisciplinary response. And yet, the fact that food waste is a large, ubiquitous problem has a silver lining. It means that we can do a very great deal of good for society and for the planet by attacking it. I know we're all eager to hear our two featured speakers, and we have a couple more people to hear from before they begin. So let me quickly move on to say a few words about this new lecture series, as well as today's event. Savor, Lectures on Food and Wine, is a truly exciting addition to the intellectual conversation at UC Davis and to our region. As a public university, we pursue a mission of excellence in education and research across the full spectrum of disciplines and professions for the benefit of California and for the world. Part of our mandate is to disseminate knowledge and to foster dialogue with other experts and with the public through events such as this one. We are especially excited by this series because it so closely reflects our institutional priorities and leverages our special strengths. We are committed to addressing the grand challenges facing our society and planet. We strongly support cutting-edge, multidisciplinary approaches to urgent, complex problems. We are ranked #1 in the nation and #2 in the world in agriculture, as well as #1 in the world in agricultural economics and policy. In addition, we are the 3rd greenest university in the world, according to some, and #7 in the world in ecology and the environment. For their efforts in making this new series a reality, I particularly want to recognize its two hosts, the Robert Mondavi Institute and the library. The Robert Mondavi Institute connects industry and the public with our departments of viticulture and enology and food science and technology, facilitating relationships and dialogue pertaining to wine, brewing, and the food sciences. The library plays a key role in advancing the success of our researchers across every discipline. Thus, it is no accident that whereas UC Davis has internationally ranked programs in food and wine, our library has some of the world's most comprehensive collections on grapes, wine, and other agricultural topics. The Robert Mondavi Institute and the library are both key pillars supporting our College of Agriculture and Environmental Sciences in scholarship, public engagement, and global impact. So let me end by thanking our two featured speakers for joining us this evening to share their knowledge and insight. Professor Edward Spang, founder of the UC Davis Food Loss and Waste Collaborative, and Congresswoman Chellie Pingree of Maine. I want to deliver a special welcome to Congresswoman Pingree on behalf of UC Davis. She is a national leader on food policy, including issues involving food waste, local food, and organic farming, and we are deeply honored to have her here with us this evening. So with you, I look forward to some very stimulating talks this evening, and thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Ken, for your greeting and informative remarks about the RMI in the library. As the new RMI director, Robert Mondavi Institute, I'm very proud to be working with the library on this new lectureship series. As Ken mentioned, the library is the foundation for public access to research scholarship, and we hope that these lectures will help engage the public in understanding research at UC Davis that is related to food and wine. Robert Mondavi established the Institute in order to provide a prestigious forum for discussing important ideas related to food and wine, and today's lecture certainly fulfills that goal. Before I introduce our faculty speaker, I also want to welcome the Honorable Chellie Pingree to UC Davis and thank her for presenting at our program this evening. Our first speaker is Edward Spang, also known as Ned, or better known as Ned. Ned is from the Boston area. He attended Dartmouth, followed by Tufts, where he earned his PhD in international relations, but with a focus on water systems. While he was a doctorate student, and I'm particularly impressed by this, he also worked full-time across town at MIT on energy systems. His subsequent scholarship has looked at the connections between energy and water use, and that focus led him to look at food waste in the context of both energy and water losses. Here at UC Davis, he continues to split his efforts with two appointments. He's an assistant professor in food science and technology, but also the associate director of the Center for Water Energy Efficiency. His research has been focusing on measuring food losses, in particular pre-harvest farm losses, an area that has been overlooked to date. However, he recognized, as Ken mentioned early on, that addressing food waste would require a very set of diverse skills. So he initiated the Food Loss and Waste Collaborative, which includes researchers from all across campus, many different disciplines. And what really impresses me, he even welcomes outsiders from UC Berkeley. Today, Ned is presenting the first part of the program entitled From Farm to Table and Back Again, Innovations to Feed More with Less. Ned.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Andy, for the kind introduction. You actually saved me a slide there, so I appreciate that. Thank you guys all for coming out today. I really appreciate it. I know it's cold and rainy, and it's nice to see all your faces out there. I'm actually used to seeing students, so this is a little bit of a different audience, but I'm happy to talk to you about my research today. It's not every day you get to share the stage with an esteemed member of Congress, so thank you so much, Congresswoman Chellie Pingree, for coming out all the way from Maine/DC to join us today, and not just for this event, but really spending your whole day listening to the Davis community and talk about this particular issue. It's very generous of you to be here, so we really appreciate it. So to give you a quick outline of what's to come in my talk, I'll give a briefer introduction now of myself, talk a little bit about food loss and waste and why I was interested in this topic, talk about 3 research areas where I've been working on this issue, and finally talk a little bit about emerging topics and future efforts in this area. So as Andy mentioned, I have this dual role on campus that keeps me hopping. I have 2 offices. I run back and forth. I'm constantly kind of switching the gears in my brain. But what's happened over time is that these 2 roles have really converged. I'm really thinking every day about food and water and energy and how they're related. How when we waste any of these resources, we're wasting some of the resources that are linked to them. So as Andy mentioned, I came to campus in 2011 and spent a lot of time measuring that interaction between water and energy systems. And this really matters in California because we've spent a lot of money on energy efficiency and we have a lot of money to spend on energy efficiency. However, on the water side, we do not have the same amount of money. We don't have statewide funds to conserve water. And so what we were trying to expose in our studies is that if you invest in water conservation, you can actually measure energy savings with that investment. And so it really opens up an opportunity for a win-win situation to save 2 resources. When I was hired into the Food Science and Technology department that was looking to include some more natural resource understanding into the study of food, maybe for a lack of creativity, I just took the same approach to food systems. I saw that there was a tremendous amount of waste, and it really sort of bothered me that all the investments to grow and transport and process our food weren't going to their full utilization. We were wasting water, we were wasting energy, we were wasting land, pesticides, fertilizer, you name it. And we weren't really doing a good job of closing the loop either. So I'm interested in this idea of when there is waste in these systems, and it's always going to be inevitable, how do we capture that waste and put it back to some productive use and not just have a net cost on our hands? So when we look at food loss and waste, you will see some big numbers out there, even in the media these days. It's kind of a hot topic, and the reason why is that we see this loss everywhere. You all experience it in your homes. We see it on farms. We see it in processing plants and in the grocery stores, restaurants, you name it. It happens everywhere. When you try to sum all that up together, and the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, has done this at the global scale, it's about 1/3 of all the food we produce. And that's a pretty shocking figure to try to wrap your head around. In a follow-up study, they attempted to calculate the economic costs associated with that, the environmental costs associated with that, and the social costs. And they came up with likewise staggering numbers of approximately $1 trillion of economic losses, $700 billion of environmental losses, and 800 or actually 900 billion in social losses. These numbers are likely imperfect. There's probably a lot of uncertainty in trying to estimate these numbers at a large scale, but the magnitude is probably pretty accurate. And so this represents a lot of money, a lot of problems that are a result of systems that aren't working perhaps as good as they could be. I like some of these other figures to try to put these big numbers into perspective. So the cropland associated with all the food that's grown but never eaten is about the size of China. It represents about 8% of global greenhouse gases, which if you think about it in terms of a country, food loss and waste would be the 3rd largest emitter behind the United States and China of greenhouse gases. The international community has responded to this issue. It's really been finally recognized as the important issue that it is, and the United States Sustainable Development Goal 12.3 is to reduce food loss and waste by 50% by 2030. So this is a really important first step to recognize this at the international level, and what's happened since is that we actually recognize this in the United States. The USDA and EPA have committed to having food loss and waste by 2030, and businesses are just doing this on their own. So once we set a target, we can start to all get behind it. And this is something that everybody recognizes. It's hard. There's not many proponents for food waste out there. They're hard to find. If you find them, send them my way. Another reason I'm really interested in this topic is that it is complicated. It seems like we all know what food loss and waste is. We experience it in our homes, as I said. Yet when we look across the food supply chain, how we define food, how we define losses, how we define waste, it matters in how we perform research and the decisions we make. So a few things to think about when we look across the food supply chain. First of all, was that food grown, that land used, was that growing food for human consumption? Because we grow corn for ethanol. We grow corn, we grow alfalfa to feed animals. So where are we drawing the boundaries around the food that's actually being lost or wasted when we try to measure these numbers at a large scale? We also want to understand the drivers behind food loss and waste. It's nice to know the quantities, but if we don't know the reason behind the losses, it's hard to do anything to fix it. So what caused the spoilage? What caused the damage? Was it packaging? Was it a refrigerated truck that broke down? There's millions of reasons across the food supply chain of why we lose food. There's also a differentiation between what we consider edible and what we consider inedible. So you might talk to, and this differs from person to person, this differs from culture to culture. So this is not a scientific breakdown between what's edible and inedible. And you read some studies and they use these words, but it's hard to understand what they're talking about because it's not necessarily transparent where they're drawing that boundary. And finally, we have edible discards that are happening across the food supply chain. This is just simply, usually, a result of mismatched supply and demand. There's a surplus somewhere in the supply chain. Sometimes we have a surplus in our own homes. We just can't eat what's there, and it spoils. There's also a distinction between the actual terms food losses and food waste based on the food supply chain. So food losses generally represent losses that happen pre-consumer, and waste happens once the food reaches the consumer. And this can be in your homes, but it can also be restaurants or other food service locations. There's another perspective in the literature that refers to food waste or food losses as overconsumption of food. And I don't study this directly. It takes sort of a more health approach to the idea. But I do experience it directly when I'm at home, and I think I'm doing a good job with food waste by eating all the leftovers my kids leave on their plate. But it's exceeding my metabolic needs. So I don't know if it's really necessarily a good thing to do. Finally, the destination of the food loss and waste matters. So it doesn't just stop, it doesn't just end in the garbage can. We have to understand where it's headed. And there's kind of an actual prioritization of where we'd like these kind of unavoidable losses to end up. So the first thing we'd like to do is not have it fall out of the food supply chain in the first place. So if we can kind of recapture some of this edible food and use it as donations or reformulate it as a new food product and get it back into the human supply chain, that's a good first step. Another option is to feed animals. It's not a direct pass back into the food supply chain, but indirectly by feeding animals, we're displacing the animal feed that they rely on and can save some resources there. There's also opportunities for biochemical extraction, and there's a lot of work on this topic at UC Davis. I can give you one example where researchers have looked at grape pomace. So when we make our lovely wine at the winery at the Robert Mondavi Institute, we have the leftover grape pomace and seeds. And you can extract really novel compounds from this waste stream, such as anthocyanins, which can either be a nutritional supplement or even a dye for textiles. But really, there's more value there than there is in this pile of waste that you're producing as a result of wine. Anaerobic digestion is an interesting technology. This is where, and it's been around for a long time. This is actually nothing new, but it's something we're turning to for many reasons actually, for recycling organics and also producing bioenergy. Because when you anaerobically digest food waste, you produce biogas. You can then use that biogas directly, or you can produce electricity, and now you're getting energy out of this previously, worthless material, or perceived as worthless. Anaerobic digestion also produces a soil amendment, basically. When the material passes through the digester, you can apply that to fields and add organic matter back into the agricultural system. Beyond that, there's composting. Again, we're using that organic material back on the fields. It's putting it to productive use, but we're not producing energy along the way. And finally, the worst case scenario is to put this in a landfill. Basically, all that happens is it's converting to greenhouse gases and making things worse. So we really want to try to avoid that at all costs where possible. The other option is really to prevent this as much as possible. I mean, there is that hierarchy of destinations, but really preventing the food loss and waste in the first place is the number one goal. So we really have to think of this issue from these multiple dimensions to come up with solutions and develop ways where we can measure if those solutions are effective so that we continue to make the right choices. So thinking about the entire food supply chain, I'll talk about a few research projects I have. On the farm, thinking about the resources we put into growing food and trying to understand losses, I was working on a project with a few colleagues here to really understand the grower perspective on losses. And so, as Andy mentioned, we recognized that there was a lack of understanding of the amount of losses on the farm, but there was also a lack of kind of a qualitative understanding from the grower perspective why the losses were occurring. So we simultaneously tried to answer those two questions, get the farmer perspective on how much losses were occurring and what they were seeing as barriers to recovering more food from the field. We examined three main crop types: tomatoes, peaches, and leafy greens. We conducted over 30 interviews with growers in the area. We learned a lot in this particular project. We really absorbed the notion that the main drivers of loss on the farm are actually external to the farm itself. So what the growers are experiencing are a drop in the price in the marketplace that make it unaffordable to go out and harvest the crop. They're going to spend money to do that and then not have a market to sell it. They can't really afford to do that. The other outside pressure is weather. There's not much you can do about that. We're trying to make it not worse through mitigating climate change, but still at the grower level, there's not much to do. And finally, when they're harvesting the fruits and vegetables, they really have to pick the material that's going to make it through the whole supply chain without spoiling. And there's a notion in there that in that decision of a grower or a picker in a farm looking at a peach and thinking about whether this peach is going to make it down the supply chain, that the loss at the farm might actually be preventing waste further down the supply chain. And that's actually a positive outcome, because on the farm, that material is going to go back to organic material and be recycled into the agricultural system. As soon as you put it into the supply chain, it's likely going to be packaged, refrigerated, transported, all at great additional investment of resources. So there's a really important decision that's being made there, and these growers understand how far this produce has to go, and they're selecting the right material for that. Another interesting discussion we had is that we read one study where they said that 70% of romaine lettuce was lost in the field. And what was happening is the researchers were going in and measuring the outside leaves of the plant and saying that was all losses. When we talked to the growers, they were saying, that field was 100% harvested. I set out to grow romaine hearts. And so it's a very different perspective. That's a wild swing in numbers based on a different definition of what's lost and what's waste. And so this is an example right here. This is actually Napa cabbage. That field has already been harvested. So there is quite a bit of biomass left in the field. And finally, where we saw solutions, they were really based on local solutions. It's not some new technology or new app that was really solving the problem. It was because the grower knew the person at the local food bank, and they knew each other's schedules, and they could call each other up when they had availability of a truck or storage in the food bank. So we really want to try to understand why that works in certain places and see where we can replicate some of those really good ideas at the local level. Another aspect of this particular project is that we conducted a life cycle assessment of growing these different crops. So what you're seeing here is a comparison of the greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of produce for romaine, fresh tomato, and processing tomato. So the first thing you can see is that between these three crops, the global warming potential is different, that romaine lettuce has a bit more greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram than either type of tomato. The other piece to take away here is that based on the amount of losses on these different crops, and we have some very rough numbers here, about 4% for processing tomato, 30% for fresh tomato, and 23% for romaine, that those losses affect the environmental impact. So for each of these crops, we have what it would look like if you could fully harvest all that material versus what happens when we include losses. And so this really allows us to measure the environmental impact of losses on the farm. And I hope this kind of creates some additional incentive to try to get more crops out of the farm, but again, we run into some of those economic limitations from the grower perspective. Another study I worked on was looking at farm losses from more of a top-down approach. So this isn't going to the growers, this isn't going to the farms, it was actually relying on USDA data. And we were really trying to understand what data does the USDA collect on losses, and how do we understand the complexity of losses on the farm using high-level national data. And what we were able to do, I was working with a graduate student, we kept looking over the different data sets, and we found that for potatoes, there was this unique combination of data available. One was that they had a separation of acres that were never harvested, so they have acres planted and acres harvested. So you can subtract those two and just know which acres were never harvested at all. So that's pre-harvest losses. Then we wanted to understand, well, why are there pre-harvest losses? So we turned to another USDA data set from the risk management agency that tracks crop insurance. And so there you get an idea of where people said, hey, I lost my crop because it was too cold, it was too wet, it was too dry, any of those reasons. And we could kind of translate that back to the acres planted, acres harvested, and get an understanding of why there were losses pre-harvest. The next data set we found for this particular study was a unique study to potatoes that had people go behind the potato harvester and actually collect all the potato material and weigh it. So we had an understanding of after it was harvested, what was still left in the field. And finally, there was data on the amount of irrigated water applied to the crop. So putting these all together, we started to actually get a more complete picture of those different dynamics of loss and waste on the farm. The results here are just showing the harvest losses relative to pre-harvest losses relative to total production, which is the gray bar. So this is for 7 leading potato producing states: Idaho, Washington, Wisconsin, North Dakota, Oregon, Minnesota, and Maine. You can see that the harvest losses are greater than the pre-harvest losses. And the interesting thing here is that when you're mechanically harvesting, potatoes are just falling through chains. So if they're too small, they fall right through the chains and are left in the field. So if you actually just decrease the size of the chains a little bit, you can get some smaller potatoes into the marketplace. And this actually adds up significantly. What they were measuring here were only potatoes that were between 1.5 inches and 2 inches, which the USDA considered marketable. So the growers were setting it at 2 inches. Meanwhile, the USDA was saying these are actually marketable potatoes that are left behind. That's a pretty easy fix in this particular situation. When we converted this to the water embedded in the potato losses, we had these results as well. So on the left, you have the absolute amount of water in those states embedded in the potato losses. And on the right, we normalize these numbers for the total production of potatoes in those states. So you can see that this is kind of total amount of water losses, and this is the intensity of water losses when you put together, water losses in potato losses, when you put it all together. And so that allows the states to be comparable. And I hope you all noticed that Maine is really off the hook here, because they don't use very much irrigation in Maine at all. So it's rain-fed potato agriculture, and what we were really tracking was irrigated water. I didn't just do this for the Congresswoman. It just worked out that way. All right, so for the next project, this was less traditional academic research, and it was really an opportunity to connect students to industry to experiment with coming up with new food products. So I was approached by the CEO of a juice company in Richmond, California, that made really high-value juices that he sold in the marketplace, but he was starting to feel guilty about all the juice pulp that was going out of the back door at his juice company. So he came and spoke to me and said, I'm really thinking there could be some value in this, this fibrous product that has nutritional value, and I think we should try to get it back into the human supply chain. He was actually sending it out as animal feed, so in terms of that food recovery hierarchy, he wasn't making a bad decision. He was doing pretty good. But this was a really fun project for my students. So we set a few goalposts for them. They had to measure and characterize the waste stream that they were using. They had to monitor the waste diverted through the product design. It had to taste good, so that's a sensory scale of greater than 6 on the hedonic scale. And they had to produce the product at less than $2 per 100 gram, and we were trying to have it be a low-cost product because we're actually leveraging a waste stream here. We thought we could do this at a lower cost. They came up with some crazy ideas. They really thought broadly. They had a vegetable pomace kimchi that I actually thought was really good because it's spreadable. Once it's gone through a juicer, it's not the big chunks. It's the spreadable kimchi that I really liked. There was one I was a little mixed on. They tried to make sort of a pulled pork sandwich with fibrous kale, and the barbecue sauce was all right, but the pulled pork, credit for thinking outside the box. But then they ended up on this final product called the Mocha Bite. And what was neat here is that they were thinking outside the box, not just with their designs, but what the material was on site. So beyond fruit and vegetable pulp, they also noticed that they were making almond milk at this site, and they were making cold brew coffee. And so one of my students, who happened to be culinarily quite talented, came up with the Mocha Bite and used almond pumice and cold brew coffee grounds to make the Mocha Bite, which is down here in the lower corner. As she continued to work on this, she developed a coconut mint flavor, a peanut butter chocolate flavor, and a matcha green tea. The students had done everything I asked them to do. They were amazing. They met all those parameters. We were very happy with the work, and I did my job as a faculty member and just nudged them a little bit further. And what I wanted them to do is actually enter a business competition with this idea. It was really kind of an interesting approach to the food system. There was an opportunity on campus. We have a Big Bang competition every year. And there was an opportunity for an award to do more with less. So I said, you guys should go for it. You have no business training, so write a business plan. And sure enough, they tied for first place, and they were able to split $5,000 from the business competition. And this was picked up, a story in the media that was really exciting. Madison up in the corner, who developed the Mocha Bite, that's her at the fancy food show in San Francisco, which is quite a big deal. She made 1,000 samples to pass out at the fancy food show, and she was interviewed at the site. So this really captures the imagination to take this approach to upcycling food products. And Dan Kurzrock is here. If you want to raise your hand, Dan, real quick. His company is called Regrained, and his bars are outside. And what Dan is doing is he's taking spent grains from the brewing process and making bars, and actually making an ingredient called the super grain that you'll probably find in more products in the future. But this idea is catching on. People really like the story behind this kind of product. One more project for you guys is actually going back to this farm to table and back again idea. So what do we do with unavoidable food waste? I mentioned before anaerobic digestion, and actually this is a really important topic for California right now. Under the legislation Senate Bill 1383, we are going to be required to divert 75% of our organic waste from landfills by 2025. That's a massive shift in material in our state. What we don't know is what that infrastructure should look like. And on top of that, what's interesting about this policy is they're recognizing that food recovery hierarchy I mentioned earlier, and they embedded in the legislation recovering 20% of edible food as well. So this is a real challenge for CalRecycle that is going to enforce this regulation, not just to develop the infrastructure, but figure out how much edible food we are throwing away in the first place. So this requires some fundamental measurement and also the deployment of new infrastructure. The question we were asking was that current AD systems tend to be relatively large. They're not necessarily located where the food is being produced. And so what happens if we, instead of trucking food waste, which is a heavy kind of low energy material long distances, what if we shorten the distance that we have to travel with this material and use a collection of much smaller digesters that are spread out over the area rather than large centralized systems? So we applied for a California Energy Commission grant that was successful, and we partnered with a company in Seattle that makes these containerized anaerobic digesters. They repurpose old fracking tanks that are actually a mobile unit that can produce electricity. Well, the fracking tank produces the biogas, and then we're going to install a combined heat and power unit that converts that biogas to electricity, heat, and then we have the soil amendment coming out of the digester as well. We're going to be tracking the types of food that are going into this digester to understand how the performance of the system varies with the different feedstocks that come from the restaurants and the grocery stores that we partner with. We'll be running experiments in a lab to start playing around with different combinations of those food materials as well, and our lab work is going to inform how we operate the system down at our site in Southern California. Finally, we're going to take our knowledge of this smaller system and think about how food waste is distributed across the state, and think about where do small digesters make sense, where do large digesters make sense in terms of siting this new infrastructure. So this is a really exciting project, and we should be installing this in the next 5 or so months down in Oxnard, California. You're all invited to come if you'd like. I'll let you know. So for next steps, I'm going to continue thinking across the whole supply chain, because I think sometimes we do get tunnel vision on the areas we work, and I think it's important to take a systems perspective to this issue, especially since some of the drivers, some of the impacts of this translate from one section of the supply chain to another. The existing challenges I mentioned before are still ongoing. We have inconsistent concepts and definitions of this issue, and not that we all have to agree on the same one, but we have to be transparent on what we're studying. And so that's something that we really feel strongly about. And I just worked on a review article with a number of colleagues here on campus, and that was one of our major suggestions, was this transparency in what we're measuring. Finally, we also looked at that FAO report I cited before, about 1/3 of the food lost and wasted, and we evaluated the quality of the data behind that study by portion of the supply chain and food type. And basically, if you look at this graphic, I don't expect you to read these numbers or anything, but the good data are the white boxes. The gray boxes, the medium data, isn't even very medium. It's pretty much data that does not exist, or it was measured once in one whole region and transferred to another entirely different region. So there's a lot of gaps in this data. And thinking from a kind of solutions-oriented perspective, we have to address the larger drivers of food loss and waste. So what I mean by that is when we went to the farm and we heard that the drivers weren't really happening on the farm, we need to step back and find out where they are happening. Is it the grading standards for the produce? Is it unstable markets? Is it anything we can do with drier and hotter climate that we can come up with better plants that are more hardy in those conditions? As I mentioned before, it requires an interdisciplinary perspective and a systems-based perspective. All of these things are connected, and it's hard to study one piece without thinking about the whole. Finally, it's going to take a portfolio approach. I know I represented those destinations in a hierarchical order, but we're going to require all of them to handle the amount of waste that we're talking about. It's just a matter of matching the right destination, the right solution to the right, the appropriately site for the particular waste stream that we're addressing. Finally, the programs we do implement require robust evaluation. That's really missing in the literature. We need to know what works. If we're going to invest a lot of money in this, we need to know what solutions work the best. And finally, there's opportunities to leverage emerging technologies, just better tracking of this kind of thing. We have sensors that are much cheaper. We can track things with barcodes and RFID tags much easier now. Let's apply some of that knowledge to the waste streams, and we can save ourselves a bit of a headache down the line. And finally, as Andy mentioned, while I was looking at this issue myself, I've been inspired by the colleagues around me, and I really felt like UC Davis had a unique collection of expertise to apply to this issue and really kind of be a formidable research center to look at this topic. And I kind of floated the idea of setting up a collaborative, but I was amazed at how quickly people came together around the issue. So in a short amount of time, less than 2 years, we have over 60 members of this Food Loss and Waste Collaborative, and they represent more than 15 different departments and research centers on campus. More importantly, this is not just faculty members, this is faculty members, students, and even staff on campus that are in our dining services department, our Office of Sustainability. So everyone's really at the table to look at this issue. And we roughly organize ourselves around many of those emerging issues I mentioned: measurement and characterization, supply chain efficiency, understanding consumer behavior, and I'm hoping I've shaped your behavior when you leave here today. And then some of those novel food waste recycling processes. How do we extract more value out of the food system? And we have folks that are, feeding food waste to insects and using that as a new pathway for handling food waste. So there's a lot of exciting opportunity. I want to thank all of the colleagues that were involved in the work I showed you. A lot of external partners involved here, funding from a variety of agencies that have supported this work. I certainly would not be able to do any of this alone. And thank you very much. I appreciate you listening.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Ned, for that very engaging presentation and your obvious mastery of and passion for this topic. It was very inspiring. My name is Mackenzie Smith, and I'm the University Librarian and Vice Provost for Digital Scholarship here at UC Davis, overseeing the library system and our data science initiative. And the library, as you heard, is partnering with the Robert Mondavi Institute to bring you tonight's program and launch this new lecture series on food and wine, areas in which, as Ken Burtis mentioned, UC Davis is internationally famous for. For the second half of our program this evening, it is my very great privilege to introduce our guest speaker, who you've already heard something about, Congresswoman Chellie Pingree. And I'm going to take a pause to do that and hope that someone can tell us how to get the Congresswoman's slides up. Hopefully they're the ones underneath there. Okay, great. Who is our speaker tonight? Congresswoman Pingree represents Maine's 1st Congressional District and is a national leader on food policy, including issues involving local food, food waste, and organic farming. As an organic farmer herself for many years, her interest in these issues is deeply personal. In fact, she is currently the only organic farmer on the House Committee on Agriculture. She also serves on the House Agriculture Appropriations Subcommittee, which is part of the House Appropriations Committee overseeing funding for the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Food and Drug Administration. Last year, she and Iowa's Republican Congressman David Young launched a bipartisan food waste caucus to explore how to address this issue through policy measures at the federal level. Among her recent legislative achievements, in 2017, she introduced the Food Recovery Act to reduce food waste across the food supply chain and support additional research on the topic. And she succeeded in getting several provisions included in the 2018 Farm Bill to support small farmers, expand funding for organic research, increase access to healthy, locally sourced food, and reduce food waste. She's introduced legislation to reduce food waste at the consumer level, in schools, and by companies that contract with the federal government. She's advocated for the USDA to support composting as a way to reduce the amount of food waste going to landfills. And she plans to reintroduce legislation to standardize the confusing array of sell by, use by, and expiration dates that contribute to people throwing out billions of dollars of perfectly safe food every year. When we sat down to develop this first program in our new speaker series on food and wine, Congresswoman Pingree was at the top of our list to bring to UC Davis because she is, without doubt, the most prominent member of Congress addressing the problem of food loss and waste today. As the nation's leading ag school, we could think of no more appropriate way to kick things off. So please join me in giving a warm UC Davis welcome to Congresswoman Pingree.
Nice. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mackenzie. Thank you to Ned and Andy and everybody who's welcomed me here today and given me a chance to meet so many of the wonderful students and faculty and staff and everyone who's working on this issue. It's really been a tropical vacation for me, being out of Maine, and a much more interesting day than a day in Washington. So thank you so much. I've really been enjoying myself, and I appreciate it very much. And I want to acknowledge Erin McGuire, who's here tonight. Erin is a Mainer who now works at UC Davis. And so we were sad to lose her in Maine, but it's exciting to see her here. And she used to do agricultural outreach in our office and worked on my first campaign. So basically, I wouldn't be in Congress if it wasn't for Erin. So that's how those things go. So that's... And I know there's a lot of people who work in the academic field and students in the room who are very used to slide presentations. In politics, we hardly ever get to use them because we're standing on the floor of the House of Representatives. So excuse me if I get confused by the notes and the, slides, but hopefully it'll provide a few pictures to explain some of what I'm talking about. But anyway, I'm really excited to be here and passionate about the topic and love anything to do with agriculture and farming, so it's just fun for me to be in a crowd that's interested in all of this. Just to start out, I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about my own background and why I'm interested in all this. Even though I represent the state of Maine, I'm actually from Minnesota, Yashri Betcha, and I'm from a Scandinavian family. My grandfather was a Norwegian immigrant, and they had a dairy farm in southern Minnesota, so I'm the little baby in the picture. And honestly, I thought growing up from a farm family that I would never have any encounter with agriculture in my life. Went to high school in Minneapolis and thought I would be as far away as I possibly could. But circumstances developed, and I ended up in the state of Maine in the early 1970s in sort of the back to the land era, and got very interested in sustainable farming and food and agriculture. I was lucky enough to be a student at College of the Atlantic in Bar Harbor, Maine, so I actually have a degree in human ecology, and it's the first time I've ever gotten to meet a few other people who do as well. So thank you for introducing me to people who didn't say, what in the world is that all about? And interestingly, as my work-study job in college, I ran the composting operation. So in 1975, there I was making compost. Little did I know what a hot topic it would be in the future. For most of the last 40-some years, I have been living on this island off the coast of Maine. This is the island of North Haven, which is in Penobscot Bay in Maine, in the heart of lobster fishing territory, but also in what used to be a very agricultural community. If you were there in 1860, there wouldn't have been a tree on the island, and there would have been 79 farms producing everything from dairy products to strawberries to lamb, much of which was sold in the Boston market because the steamship would come by every night and pick things up and have them in Boston the next morning. So you don't think of Maine as an agricultural state, but actually we have a lot of history there and a real resurgence in what's going on. So I've run a small farm and a market garden operation for much of the last 45 years. That's a long time ago when my kids were little, and they now run much of the operation. And today we still have a farm called the Turner Farm, and we run an inn and restaurant that actually goes back over 100 years, the original inn. And our farm serves, farm-to-table meals and barn dinners and kind of all of the things that have really become an important part of agricultural marketing today. This is a picture of our farm in the summer. Doesn't look like that today, I'll tell you, but we do grow, because of our short season, we grow in movable plastic hoop houses, and then we also grow in 3 permanent greenhouses that are heated by waste wood that we collect on the property. So we are a year-round operation and actually have a winter CSA selling kale and spinach and things that we can grow and sustain in the winter. This here today would be like a nice June day for us. So picture that in below zero weather. So anyway, that's a little bit about what I do, and I'm very interested in, while I'm here to talk about food waste, in my 10 years in Congress, I have been serving either on the Agriculture Committee or Agriculture Appropriations, and I'm particularly interested in organic and sustainable agriculture and the impact of climate change and how farms can be an important part of the solution, and farming techniques can be encouraged that will help us deal with some of the greenhouse gas issues. And also I work on local food production and, you know, everything related to that that's been often left out of our food system, and we try to encourage its introduction into the Farm Bill and into our agricultural appropriations. So that's kind of my focus. And over the last few years, I've really gotten interested in this topic of food waste. At first, I didn't think it was such a dramatic topic and that there were more edgy and complicated issues to work on, but as I learned more about it, and this slide said 40%, but some people say 30%, but whatever that range is, it's an awful lot of food to go to waste, and Ned really did a great job of explaining just how much that impacts everyone's life. It's not just an issue, of course, in the United States, it's worldwide, and you know, so much of what we're producing today is going to waste, and we're certainly in the United States some of the biggest wasters in the world, so that's certainly a issue of great concern. It's also an issue in terms of its climate change impact. You know, people often think, well, it went to the landfill, so it will just disappear, and of course it doesn't. It turns into methane gas and contributes, and is a much more powerfully dangerous gas than just CO2. If we've heard some of these statistics before, it would be the third largest country, and this report from Drawdown puts it as the third most important thing to solve in terms of fixing our climate change and environmental impacts. So it's a good sign. If we fix this, we've come a long way in dealing with some of the challenges that we have in front of us. Of course, one of the tragic things is that we have so many people who are food insecure in this country, and figuring out how to get that food, instead of being wasted, but into the hands of people who need it would go a long way to solving some of those problems in the wealthiest country in the world. To think that people and children go hungry every day is really unimaginable, and one of the most important reasons we have to do something about this. So there's been a lot of progress made, I think, in drawing attention to this, but also in the focus on it. And some of it happens in the private sector, where people have focused on gleaning operations, going to farms to pick up what doesn't get harvested. Food donations, of course, have become an enormous part of making sure food does get into the hands of the people who need it. There are groups, a lot of retailers have really taken on this strategy, and we're very proud of this particular supermarket chain in Maine that has made it a goal to eliminate food waste, and looking at it from both how you get more into the hands of customers, but also in making sure that it's going to be composted if there is no opportunity in the middle. Feeding the 5,000, done by Tristram Stewart, has been a great way to sort of outline and showcase this in cities around the country where lunches are produced for people, and feeding 5,000 people off of food waste. And then, of course, some of the things that were talked about methane gas production and using energy production and composting. And a lot of municipalities now have these garbage to garden systems where you can have someone come and collect your food waste. But I think there's a lot more we could be doing, and that's a lot of what I've been doing, working on this particular issue. So in 2015, here in my local food co-op, with all the supportive players in this field, we introduced the Food Recovery Act first in 2015 and then again in 2017. And as you've heard a little bit about it, it's a really comprehensive bill, and that's often what you do in Congress. You try to write a very comprehensive piece of legislation that covers everything across the entire food system and what we need to do, whether it's on a school or a farm or a restaurant or retail operation. And then your goal, because perhaps as you've heard, that it's hard to get a big piece of legislation passed in Congress today. It's sometimes hard to get anything passed in Congress today, but you can take a big comprehensive piece of legislation, make it a way to discuss everything, and then take pieces out, and that's some of what we've been working on. And so we've done a variety of things to try to promote this. Some of it has been to encourage schools and institutional partners to purchase what is called ugly fruit or ugly vegetables, things that don't meet the grade A specification, but are perfectly good to use, and you know, certainly are an important thing to do. Working on proposals that give farmers credit for composting and seeing that as part of the strategy. And one thing you heard about earlier, and this has been a proposal we've been working on for a long time and hope we're getting a little closer, and this is on date labeling. You can see that products have a huge range of labels, and you've all had this experience where you go into the cupboard and you pull it up and you see this label and you think, okay, do I have to throw this away because it's a month after that date, or is it perfectly good? And in a lot of households, there's an argument that takes place between two people in the household. So we thought if we could sort of fix this problem, it would do a lot for domestic harmony. But the fact is that only infant formula is actually given a date label that has significance, and everything else is a decision made by the processor or manufacturer or the packager. So we've been working on a system that would basically say a best by date and a use by date, and the best by would indicate that it would be best if you ate this by a certain date, but the crackers or the soup won't make you ill, it won't harm you, it just wouldn't maybe necessarily taste as good. And then use by would be for those products where it was critically important not to eat it after that date. And of course it would need to come with a whole education campaign so that we all knew actually what the labels meant, but if we had a starting point, we could do that. And we've had incredibly good cooperation actually from the food industry, which I think feels somewhat frustrated by this confusion too. But we have yet to get a piece of legislation passed. We think we're getting closer, and we've worked with the industry on voluntary standards, but also to refine how to go about doing it. And some of the challenges are just the very idea of having an agency, whether it's the FDA or the USDA, that sets these standards and figure out what is the best date for every possible product you can imagine, and that's complicated. But we are hoping that we get past it. And interestingly, it may be the most cost-effective thing you can do to reduce food waste. There's a great report put out, it was called Refed, and they looked at it as one of the things that had the least amount of input to actually change in terms of what it cost, but a huge impact, not only in the home, where you might throw away a lot of things that you don't need, but in a lot of retail establishments where everything's taken off the shelf, or states that have arbitrary labeling. So states can have all different sources of labeling, and it may not apply to exactly what the appropriate decision should be. So we would really love to pass this bill and are working hard to get ourselves to that point, and hopefully this will be the Congress that does it. So as you heard, we have been working on some of these provisions, and some of them we're going to have were included in the 2018 Farm Bill. We do a farm bill, as many of you know, because this is an agricultural college. We do this every 5 years, and hopefully we get it done on time. Sometimes it takes us a year longer. Sometimes it's extremely contentious. Usually we fight for almost an entire year just about nutrition and the SNAP benefits, and SNAP benefits are about 80% of a farm bill, and that's where all the argument takes place. But as many of you know, there are a lot of other provisions that go in there, and so we worked really hard to get some of these provisions in this year's Farm Bill, and we're able to do that. So here's a few of them that you heard about, but a couple you've heard about, but that we've actually managed to do. So we have a food waste liaison now at the USDA. Unfortunately, the USDA has been shut down pretty much ever since Congress restarted again. But we're looking forward to that. That's the first full-time position that's been there for a very long time in relation to this. So that will help coordinate some of this work and put the focus on it. We have a new composting pilot program that the USDA can partner with local and municipal governments to help develop and test strategies that would support municipal composting plans and food waste reduction plans, and we have $25 million for that pilot program, so that's a great start. Biogas Opportunities Task Force, which is a glamorous title, but of course there's really some amazing opportunities for both small and large biogas digesters, and we think that there will be some opportunities in a potential infrastructure bill to support more of this in municipal and private systems. The one bright light in working on food waste issues is it's truly bipartisan. I started a food waste caucus. Caucuses in Congress are a group of members who get together to discuss particular issues or to promote an issue, and they can be, all women's rights issues, or they can be a small country in the Middle East that you all are caring about. So there's a huge diversity of these caucuses, but it usually gives you an opportunity to find like-minded members of Congress who want to work on these issues, to do briefings to your colleagues. And we've been able to do this in a bipartisan way. I founded it with David Young of Iowa. Unfortunately, David Young lost his race. So we've started all over again with Dan Newhouse, who's also a really great Republican member from Washington. He's a hops grower, cares deeply about agriculture. So that's a great thing, and we're excited to get to work on that. The Secretary convened a food waste roundtable, so we've had good working relationships with Secretary Perdue. That's my departed friend, David Young. But that was a good start, that we got a lot of people around the table to start talking about this last year. And then the USDA, EPA, and FDA have started, they've signed a memorandum of understanding to better coordinate their work. And it is complicated which agency regulates what and how you work together. So we're really excited about that. So in terms of what's coming next, this is the new Congress and the new emphasis in Congress on all issues related to climate change, and we think food waste fits in very nicely with that. Renewable energy production with things like biogas are great, and so we're excited that virtually every committee in Congress that has any jurisdiction over anything related to climate change will be holding hearings and looking for potential legislation around this. We're going to have the special select committee on climate change and a proposal coming from them, so that will be great. And there's just a lot of enthusiasm of people who've been elected to Congress this term, with voters who in really enormous numbers are saying we want to focus on climate change. We are worried about the future, and 8 years of not discussing it is just 8 years too long. So I feel really hopeful about the opportunities in front of us, and feel like it's going to be a great time to educate the public in having these kinds of public discussions around it, and also hopefully move forward with legislation and investment in some of these challenges that are in front of us. But we're really grateful to institutions like this that are bringing people together of all disciplines, because we're going to need so much technical support and research and documentation to really move forward on a topic that's been little understood and little coordinated. And I don't want to be the only person in this field working on it. So I'm really excited about that. And just end with our contact information, and anything that you want to share with us, we're anxious to hear. And I'm really, again, thrilled to be in a room full of like-minded people and to see the great work that you're doing out here. So thank you very much for allowing me to share this all with you.
Thank you, Congresswoman. That was very interesting. And now we have about 20 minutes or so to interrogate our speakers for the evening. And my role here is to moderate this, and we have someone with a microphone out there, this gentleman in the back. So I hope that you've found these talks inspiring and might have a question or two for our speakers. Anybody want to kick it off? Andy.
So Ned, I was intrigued with your own research on losses on farm, like before they're harvested, because apparently a lot of that's not characterized very well in the literature. And I guess I was wondering if you had to do one thing to help. I mean, I don't know if there is one thing, but if you had to do one thing to reduce those losses, would it be, I don't know, technical, or is more market driven? So I was just trying to probe you on what approaches might be the best in that situation.
Good question. I wish I had a silver bullet response, but I do think a lot of it is market driven. So growers want to sell what they grow. So if there is an outlet for that, they will do it. Part of that is developing alternative markets, and I think of that kind of geographically. So if they're used to selling peaches long distances away, if they have some peaches that are overripe, they could find a local outlet to sell that a little bit more easily. We talked to one grower who had a peach in his hand and said, this is the peach that'll make it to market. It'll break your windshield. But the peach that I could eat right now will never make it that far. So that peach that you can eat right now should hopefully make it somewhere. So that's one of those local solutions. Relaxing some of our expectations as consumers of what we expect to see when we go to the grocery store is also part of the role for all of us. We talk about the opportunities of imperfect or ugly produce, but when we talk to the growers, they were also concerned that they don't want to undercut their grade A market by having all of a sudden a cheaper available option. And it doesn't cost any less to grow those ugly fruit. It costs the same amount to grow that ugly fruit. So there's a number of challenges there, but certainly there is some opportunity in the marketplace to find a home for that food.
Yeah, and I'll just add, dealing with the grading system is something we haven't completely tackled yet, but I had a chance to talk to a couple of people about it today, because obviously there's a lot of experts in a university like this, but grading systems were developed a very long time ago, many of them, and a lot of them are much more related to cosmetic appeal or transportability. And consumers have changed. If you think about tomatoes are a good example. There was sort of the classic green rock hard tomato that could make it across the country and back twice. It could travel on your vacation with you and still not be ripe. So, but today, I know from running a farm stand, people walk in and they want to know if you've got heirloom tomatoes or something that's going to taste delicious the minute they get it home. And so our standards have changed. Same with, peaches. The difference between a fresh, ripe peach and one that's never going to get ripe somehow. So I think grading standards were so much about cosmetic appeal and transportability, and even being able to adjust some of that would be helpful. And it's complicated. Like every issue we talk about, this is about a very big food system that's designed on, you grow in California, we eat it in Maine. But interestingly, consumers are also interested in more locally available produce. They want to meet the farmer. They want to go to the farm stand. And some of that helps to deal with this situation, because if you're basically growing for a local market, and we're not going to change the entire food system because we're not going to grow enough lettuce in Maine in the winter to meet the need, and we appreciate that you grow it for us. But when those things do, work out, it makes it more possible that you can have a riper tomato and sell it right away, or you're growing it, and if you have excess, the local food bank. Also, another phenomena that we've lost a little bit, but there's some return to it, is the more diversified farm. After I talked to a group about food waste, a farmer came up to me and said, what's wrong with you? Why don't you just go back to the way we used to grow things, when you had some animals and grew some produce, and you could also make value-added products on your farm. So I raise pigs on my farm, and we also run a restaurant. So when we're done scraping the plates, at the end of the day, the pigs can eat their waste. Or if we have too much in the field, the chickens can peck at it and get what they need. And so that kind of a diversified farm, and there are more examples of that sort of coming back, again, because consumers are interested, or people, belong to a CSA that's part of a diversified farm, and there's a way to go about doing it. But we're not going to change all of American agriculture to do that, but those are things to think about, and in kind of a hidden value of a more diverse agricultural system than just sort of the way we've been going.
A couple of questions in the back.
I actually have two questions. Ned, the anaerobic digester and the methane gases were on two different lines, so I'm kind of curious if the digesters create the methane gas, which is, a very big problem for the atmosphere. And then for the representative, the dates, will you have both dates on the package? The best used by and discard by, which would give a range, of course, for discounting, as well as knowing what to do with what you have.
Great, so I can answer the first one. The anaerobic digester does create methane, but you're capturing it and burning it as biogas. So it's at the end of it, you're actually releasing CO2 and producing energy. But it's from a renewable energy source, and so sort of more of a closed loop approach to producing renewable energy. There is always a risk that you might leak some methane out of a digester, and there's usually a backup system so that if the generator is down, you would flare the methane, and it's not producing energy, unfortunately, but you're not releasing methane directly to the atmosphere, you're actually burning it and converting it to CO2. Again, not great, but a lot less harmful than direct methane emissions.
And it's a great suggestion. I think we're still struggling with sort of the two label system, and it would just take we have a basic lack of information in a sense to really have a definitive label, because you can't, Best Buy is going to be a term that a manufacturer is going to say, okay, I think these crackers are good for about 6 months. So I'm going to say Best Buy for 6 months or Best Buy for 2 months. Use by, we're trying to look at that as something that's definitive for a product that's really unsafe. So like you shouldn't eat a deli meat maybe after a certain time, or there's some products. But a can of soup, it may be, you could take it with you for 50 years and still eat the soup. So it may be hard to say that there's ever a danger moment. But it's a good point, and I think if we could get a little more refined about it, and if it was a requirement, I think manufacturers would actually somewhat take it more seriously, and then we would too. Now we just look at those things and it's a source of total confusion.
We have one in the back and then the front. I think there was a question. Yeah.
Hi. Nice to see you again. And my question actually follows on that. Has there been any discussion when you were putting together, starting the conversation on labeling, a produced on date and not necessarily a best buy date, so that it guides the consumer as to when, like how long ago was this made, doesn't necessarily say when you should eat it by. And I understand that there would be products that you do, for health and safety, you would need to give them an expiration date. But a lot of things, your can of soup, for example, it's almost a disservice to everyone to have a best buy. It really, it gives you less guidance, actually.
It's another good point, and I think it's still, part of it is we just have sort of lost touch with a lot of information about food. So if you were to put a produce by date, I think it would be very useful for a lot of people who are like, oh, good, I'm glad to know that was the date this was made. And actually, some products have that. You'll see that it'll say, what day it was bottled or put on the shelf. But there's such a variety, and I think part of it is just the consumer is, most of us just don't know. Like, is a cracker good for 6 months from when it was made, or is it good for 3 months? And sometimes it depends on the ingredients in the cracker, how many preservatives, what kind of packaging it's in. There's just a lot of variables in it. But it's a good point. If you sort of know what you're dealing with, the nicest thing would be to know what day it was made.
What's the role of agricultural financing? What's the role of agricultural financing? There's a lot of costs associated with a lot of this. Has that community, in its variety of ways, been a facilitator, been an inhibitor, been interested?
It's a good question.
I guess I'll take a stab at it. I haven't really thought about the role of financing directly. I think in terms of costs, it did come up a lot in conversation that it's in the agricultural markets, or the growers that we were talking to, they're already operating on such thin margins that the idea of doing something else seemed to be a lot. To potentially pack 2 different types of tomatoes, one for local market and one for the faraway market.
I think you have a tremendous opportunity to educate people who are in the stream of delivering the money to do various kinds of things. I think I am excited about the opportunities. I just don't think you're reaching the people who can help make it happen by being supportive of those ventures because of the ultimate impact on their customers, borrowers, etc. And I think you're broadening the scope, but I think you're missing an ingredient that's absolutely essential: money.
So are you thinking about, when you need to get financing, say, to be a farmer, that someone takes into account the losses that you're incurring and how you could account for that or do a better job with that? Or are you looking at people who are getting involved in businesses that might use a waste product?
I'm both. I'm saying that there are the things that you were talking about that require capital investment.
Right.
There is an opportunity. There is a function of being able to further utilize your stream of investment because you are not so narrow. There's a longer time. There's different. I mean, your greenhouses and other kinds were fascinating to look at. That technology has to be put into the general circulation so that then, hey, I can finance that to do something because I'm aware of it. I mean, you get a closed loop if everybody is people who are limited to knowing the science. You have to get into the stream of money.
So I have kind of a related question to that, if we could take a different approach. And that is, in California, we're often willing to take risks and tax ourselves and try experiments. I happen to live in Berkeley, where we had the first soda tax in the country. And so what are examples or exemplars of local legislation or local investment from municipal or county or even state governments that could really make a difference? Are there examples from California that you're aware of, or other states where, we could think about doing something locally that would be a lot easier to implement than, a Food Recovery Act in the short term?
Well, I do think, and maybe I'm not getting the right answer, but for that, I mean, obviously California, I forget the number of the legislation, but the one that says you can't put organic waste in a landfill.
For example.
I mean, that's going to create an enormous amount of innovation because all of a sudden we have to change. That's a dramatic change. And I think New York City has similar legislation coming up, the state of Vermont. I mean, so municipalities and then the giant state of California are actually going to push us to figure this out because, prior to this, you could run a restaurant and you just throw everything in the trash. Now that's not going to be an option. And so I think a lot of this innovation is going to start to happen very quickly as these things change. That's the stick approach. On the carrot side, I think there are municipalities that have voluntarily decided to have composting facilities at their landfill, partly because landfills are just filling up too quickly or dealing with all that organic waste being thrown away, so they'd rather sort of go into composting, and some municipalities are already doing that. So that's creating some innovation and opportunities, and there's some entrepreneurship going on because businesses are starting up that are part of the collection system or making the compost and reselling it. I mean, that's just sort of one thing off the top of my head, but I think that's going to change things very dramatically. And I guess from the federal side, we've been looking for, part of what we have been trying to look at is like existing programs that already are available to municipalities to deal with solid waste and making sure that they do cover anaerobic digesters and composting facilities, not just how big of a hole can you dig in your community and fill it up, or incinerators or other things that maybe aren't as productive.
I would also add that the project I presented before on the small-scale anaerobic digester, there's a lot of uncertainty with that technology. And so our role as an academic institution is to implement this and measure how it's performing so that we can provide some more guidance to entrepreneurs about whether this is an avenue worth pursuing.
Right.
And there's a lot of learning to get from point A to point B on that particular technology.
Yeah. Okay, we have time for one or two more questions, so let's go to this side.
Thank you.
The bulk of the effort has been focusing on one side, which is the supply side. We keep on pushing for our efficiencies and labeling to satisfy the demand. And if you look at all the efforts that have been taking place, it's always trying to push efficiency to get the best products or a certain set of products at the cheapest cost possible to satisfy the demand. And very little has been done from the demand side, where we try to train the users, which is us, on using different types of products. This is why our mind has been trained to use standard looking tomatoes, standard looking lettuce. Everything is standardized. I come from a culture where the tastiest products are actually the ugliest. I mean, the tomato that is weird looking, put some olive oil next to it, and this is one of the best meals that you can get. So what can be done from the demand side to bring the balance?
Well, I do think that we've had a lot of change in our culture in the last 10 to 20 years. I mean, people really have sort of gone back to looking at taste, nutritional value. There has been some shifting back towards that, I think, from an era of just valuing, highly processed food or less tasty food, or forgetting what food was supposed to taste like. So, I mean, some of that is just cultural, and the more interest we have in it, and the more we sort of want to continue to change that, and the more we can make it available sort of regardless of your income level, that fruits and vegetables, and that's a valuable part of everything from school lunch to what people can access with things like SNAP benefits. So I think that's important. I also think there's a cultural thing. I mean, recycling became such a part of our culture post 70s and 80s that you wouldn't automatically throw a bottle in the trash if you were in a place where recycling was possible. Or in my state, we have a bottle bill. So, you get a 5-cent deposit on a bottle. So you just don't even think about throwing that away. It became part of our culture. And I think we've been in a very confused decade about things like climate change and what's our role in it. And we've been in this kind of political debate of, was it even real? Were we responsible? Did we have any obligation? And my intention is to, be part of bringing us back into that conversation again. And I think we have a tendency to want to be responsible if we know what we're supposed to do. But we've been so confused about what are we kind of supposed to do. So, not wasting food, I think we can reintroduce that idea. Everybody has a grandmother who told you not to waste your food and to clean your plate. And it's not a partisan issue. It's not ideological. We actually don't like looking at slides that say 30% of our food is wasted. So I think reintroducing that and bring it back is kind of on the demand side. And people will start to say, like, oh, well, I shouldn't waste this food. Or look, here's a way I can, buy from the shelf that says this was going to go to waste, but take it home and, make tomato sauce out of it or whatever.
Yeah, I would agree there's a real strong role to think about the consumer in this area as well. In the UK, they did a nationwide campaign called Love Food, Hate Waste, and I mentioned there's a lack of rigorous evaluation in a lot of these projects. That study was actually quite rigorous, and they measured about a 6 to 7% reduction in household food waste as a result of that campaign. So that's just spreading the word. But it's hard to do. It's hard to change people's minds. There are behavioral economists working in this area that are trying to think of little nudges here and there that can get us to change our habits. It's not an overnight fix. It's something that takes a long time. The third way I would think about kind of reaching out is to get this information into schools. Kids are some of the best receptors of this kind of information. And actually, Amber, there you are. Raise your hand. Amber Stott is here from the Food Literacy Project, and so that's exactly their take on understanding food systems and sustainability, is to reach the young ones on some of these messages.
And I think that's a growing thing in schools where, food waste is being talked about. Schools have school gardens. Schools are going back to doing cooking in the cafeteria instead of just having a prepackaged meal brought in for every student. And that's such a positive trend. And as you said, nobody wants their fifth grader coming home and yelling at them because they're wasting food, because we don't do that in school anymore. And that's some of the best ways to go about doing it. I think composting, in the communities that have adopted composting, or that there are now commercial services available, I find that one of those like really fascinating things that we can return to. You know, from my slide, you can see that I did it in college, and I've always had, you know, a bucket of compost on the countertop. But for a long time in our culture, that's just been this idea. Why would you have garbage sitting on your countertop? What are you doing? You know, we have garbage disposals, we do all those other things, but sort of reintroducing that ethic and saying, no, you fill up this bucket, you put it on the curb, then, you know, sometime later on, somebody delivers this bucket of beautiful compost and you put it in your garden, and, you know, what a great exchange. But we've sort of lost touch with that because we took it out of our culture. But in a lot of communities, they brought it back, and people managed to survive with garbage sitting on their countertop, you know? Works great.
Including Davis.
Question in the back.
Hi, two quick ones. One, so Ned, you sit in, you know, the food science department, et cetera. So putting on your science and technology enterprise hat, what would you request of the Congresswoman to support from a, you know, deep tech, you know, science and technology investment perspective? What is the technology or technologies that you would want her to support and invest more in at the federal level? And number two, from both of you, what do you guys think the role of food banks is looking forward in this food waste sort of paradigm perspective?
Those are two big questions. Thanks, Harold. I get really excited. My last note on the moving forward slide is really improving the information technology role in the food systems, because there's so many potential benefits of that. If we think to the recent romaine lettuce E. coli outbreak, where we knew this was an issue, but as soon as we found out where the particular region was, where the problematic lettuce was, we didn't really know which package of lettuce was from there or not. That is a solvable issue with today's technologies. The issue and what we need the government for is to help have those players talk to each other, so that as a product moves down the supply chain, everyone can sort of agree on the information system that's used. Not an easy fix, but something that we could use some guidance on from a regulatory perspective, and a number of technologies embedded in that kind of information food supply chain. So I would really like to see some movement there. What was your second question again?
Role of the food banks.
Oh, role of the food banks. Also a very important player in this system. What I'd like to say is that there is a lot of opportunity to capture edible food and bring it to food banks, but that's not solving the issue of food insecurity on a large scale. There's other drivers, and it's a much bigger issue on its own. While there's an opportunity to deliver some wasted food back into the food system, that's kind of a small Band-Aid type fix to the larger issue of food insecurity. So I do want to see that connection increasingly made, but it's not at the loss of addressing those bigger issues. So thank you.
And so again, you know, information technology, I think we've seen some really innovative work that people are doing, and we didn't really talk about it today, but, you know, apps where people can, you know, enter in information about what surplus food you have going on your farm, and, you know, retailers or restaurateurs can find it. And I mean, there's just so much in this fast-paced information world. We don't do a very good job on data collection and information technology in the food system. It's just kind of a mishmash of a lot of confusing stuff that doesn't always work together and talk to each other. And food banks are really, I mean, they're just a critical part of the delivery system in dealing with waste food, whether it's, you know, gleaners from food banks who go into fields and harvest things that wouldn't economically have been viable for the farmer, farmers donating to them, people who grow directly for them, organizations like, you know, the wonderful student group here that's really doing a huge amount of work collecting surplus food at Davis and getting it to lots of food banks in the area. And those, they're part of a network in college campuses all over the country, and that's just great. There is a very complicated, you know, debate that's going on, and I wish you guys would do a lot of research on this to explain to us what we should do. But food insecurity in our country, as I said early on, I mean, we shouldn't be the wealthiest nation in the world, and it'd be so hard for people to access food, and even harder to access healthy food. And food banks have done an incredible job. I mean, they're turning into these massive institutions with huge storage buildings and refrigerator space and distribution networks, and many of them are starting to focus on healthy, nutritious food, not just getting calories into people's diets and making that shift. And it's all been really impressive how they've met the challenge. Yet at some point, you shouldn't have to go to a food bank or a food pantry or deal with some kind of complicated and sometimes embarrassing system just because you're out of work for a while or because you're not making enough on your job to pay for the food you want to put on your family's table. And that's, that's just such a contentious debate, is why I said 80 to 85% of the Farm Bill is about SNAP benefits and nutrition programs, and it's where we have huge fights every year, and it's usually what holds up the bill. But we should be figuring out a food distribution system in our country, so that is one thing you don't have to worry about. And part of, not really covered in this topic today, but some of the things I've worked on and a lot of my colleagues care deeply about is how to make sure that if you're going for SNAP benefits or a WIC program, that you can get healthy food, and programs have been implemented to give you double the bucks. If you go to a farmer's market or buy fresh vegetables, you can access more. And we just introduced a pilot program on food as medicine, a prescription program, produce prescription program, so a practitioner can actually write you a prescription to get healthy food, even if you can't afford it, but to make sure it gets into your diet. But those are all kind of band-aids, as you said, and this shouldn't be a big issue we're debating, but we know so much about how important healthy food is for child development, how the increasing issues around child obesity and adult disease in our country are really impacting our medical system and the costs of healthcare in this country, and that's something I hope you guys can get fixed for us by next year. Thank you.
So with that, I hate to draw this to a close, but we're a little over time, so I want to get everybody out on time, and please join me in thanking our speakers again.